A city of 500,000 people spent Monday night with no power, sleeping in the streets, while volunteers searched collapsed buildings by torchlight. That's Pereira, Colombia, right now, one of several cities caught in the middle of the deadliest earthquake this country has faced in years. A magnitude 7.4 struck western Colombia on Monday morning, and in the roughly 36 hours since, the death toll has climbed so fast that different agencies can't even agree on a single number. This isn't a story that fits neatly into a single headline figure, and treating it that way would actually undersell how serious and how fluid this situation still is on the ground. I want to take you through this disaster properly. What actually happened, what conditions look like, city by city right now, why the numbers keep changing, and what the science says about why an earthquake this deep still managed to flatten buildings across an entire region. Just after 7:30 on Monday morning, August 10th, the ground broke roughly 250 miles west of Bogota, near a rural community called San Jose del Palmar in Choco province. Both the U.S. Geological Survey and Colombia's own geological service measured the rupture at magnitude 7.4 at a depth of approximately 107 kilometers. That's genuinely deep for an earthquake capable of this much destruction, and it's a detail worth holding on to because it explains a lot about why the damage spread as far and as wide as it did. A magnitude 5.0 aftershock followed within the hour, and by Tuesday, Colombia's Geological Service had logged more than 70 additional aftershocks rippling out from the same general zone. The Colombian Geological Service has officially confirmed this as the strongest earthquake the country has recorded in the 21st century. The shaking itself reached an extraordinary footprint, felt in the capital, Bogota, all the way out to the Caribbean coast at Barranquilla and across international borders into both Ecuador and Panama. The USGS estimates roughly 10.5 million people experienced strong to very strong shaking from a single earthquake. If you've been following this story across different news outlets, you've probably noticed the numbers don't match, and that's worth explaining, rather than glossing over. Colombia's president, Abelardo de la Espriella, gave an official Tuesday figure of at least 181 confirmed dead and 1,595 injured, with 195 people reported missing through formal government channels. The United Nations Humanitarian Office, OCHA, working from official figures collected Monday night, put the confirmed death toll at 126, with close to 1,500 injured. Independent media tallies, built from regional government reports, have run considerably higher than either of those figures, with some counts surpassing 220 dead by Tuesday, and local estimates from provincial authorities reaching as high as 250. Separately, and this is the number that's genuinely hard to process, civilian-run tracking databases, where families have been posting information about missing loved ones, suggest the true number of unaccounted for people could be as high as 3,900. That figure hasn't been confirmed by officials, and it likely includes a lot of overlap with people who've simply lost contact with relatives rather than being confirmed trapped or dead, but it gives you a sense of just how chaotic communications have been across the affected region. Whatever specific number you're looking at in any given headline, officials at every level of government have said the same thing consistently. Expect these figures to keep rising as search teams reach areas that remain physically difficult to access. Pereira, home to more than 500,000 people in Colombia's Risaralda region, has taken the worst of this disaster by most measures. Early reports out of the Risaralda region put deaths at 40 in the earthquake's immediate aftermath. By Monday evening, an update from the Colombian Association of Capital Cities placed the toll in Pereira, specifically at 60 or higher, a number that's almost certainly moved since. The city lost electricity almost entirely as the earthquake tore through its infrastructure, and residents spent that first night sleeping outdoors, some out of genuine fear of further aftershocks bringing down already damaged buildings, others because they simply had nowhere safe left to sleep. One resident, a 38-year-old housewife whose entire neighborhood had collapsed around her, told a French news agency she'd spent the hour since the earthquake, wondering what would become of her family's life from here. Volunteers moved through blacked-out streets carrying handheld torches, working through the wreckage of collapsed buildings in search of survivors, including a 6-story building of shops and offices, where rescuers believe 2 girls remained trapped beneath the rubble. In a separate rescue that captured real attention locally, 16 people were pulled to safety from an aerial cable car system in Pereira, after being stranded roughly 6 hours following the initial quake. That cable car rescue is a genuinely telling detail about how widely this earthquake's disruption reached. Since it wasn't a building collapse at all, it was ordinary public transit infrastructure left stranded mid-route when the ground shook hard enough to trip the system's safety mechanisms and halt operations entirely, leaving passengers suspended for hours until rescue crews could reach them. Cali, Colombia's 3rd largest city, became the other major epicenter of this disaster's human toll. Local officials counted at least 20 large buildings that collapsed completely, with roughly 380 more sustaining damage, severe enough to trap people inside. What made the response in Cali particularly striking was watching search professionals and ordinary residents working side by side, passing broken chunks of concrete hand to hand down long human chains, everyone doing what they could to reach anyone still alive beneath the wreckage. A scene that echoed similar grassroots rescue efforts seen in neighboring Venezuela following that country's own earthquake disaster earlier this year. Cali's mayor reported at least 188 people missing across the city. Almost 30 hours after the earthquake first struck, rescue workers pulled a woman out alive from beneath a collapsed building. A moment captured on video that spread widely, a genuine reminder that survival windows in collapsed structure rescues can extend meaningfully longer than the first critical hours typically emphasized in disaster response training. A separate video, just as widely shared, showed rescuers pulling a baby from the wreckage of an apartment building elsewhere in the same city. Authorities imposed an 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew across Cali, specifically to protect residents, while search and rescue work continued through the night. The earthquake also triggered a fire at a jail in nearby Buenaventura, which killed at least 4 people and sent 2 more to the hospital, according to the regional governor. The destruction wasn't limited to just Pereira and Cali. In Manizales, the mayor described severe citywide damage, with the local death toll holding at 5 as of Tuesday morning, even as officials there reported already fielding thousands of requests from residents needing formal structural assessments of their homes, a process they expect will take at least a month to work through given the sheer volume. The La Italia district, sitting close to the actual epicenter, has been dealing with structural damage on top of a complete loss of water and electricity, more than a full day after the earthquake struck, according to a local community leader working in the area. 7 separate airports in Manizales, Quibdó, Armenia, Cartago, Buenaventura, and Pereira suspended all operations entirely while engineering teams inspected runways and terminal buildings for structural integrity. 5 capital cities across the country were placed under red alert, Colombia's highest disaster classification level. President de la Espriella's own figures put more than 100 homes destroyed nationwide and over 8,300 more damaged, numbers that officials expect to keep climbing as assessment teams reach more remote mountainous stretches of the affected provinces. It's worth understanding the actual mechanics behind why an earthquake originating 107 kilometers underground, genuinely deep by earthquake standards, was still capable of this much destruction spread across such a wide area. Colombia sits directly on the Pacific Ring of Fire, where the Nazca Oceanic Plate is being forced beneath the South American Continental Plate in an ongoing subduction process that's been running for millions of years. Earthquakes that originate deep within that subducting slab, what seismologists call intermediate depth earthquakes, can release enormous energy across a genuinely broad geographic footprint, precisely because that depth allows the seismic waves to radiate outward over a much wider area, rather than concentrating their destructive force in a small zone directly above a shallow rupture. That's the actual physical reason this earthquake was felt as far away as Bogota and the Caribbean coast, even while the most severe structural damage concentrated specifically in the mountainous, densely built coffee-growing provinces closer to the epicenter. Low-intensity tremors are genuinely common across central and western Colombia, part of daily life for people living along this stretch of the Ring of Fire, but earthquakes above magnitude 6 are rare events here. There's an important contrast worth drawing here for anyone trying to understand why a deep earthquake still caused this much visible collapse. Shallow earthquakes, the kind that strike within just a few kilometers of the surface, tend to produce extremely violent but more geographically contained shaking, since the energy has less distance to travel before reaching buildings directly overhead. Deep or intermediate depth earthquakes like this one trade some of that concentrated intensity for reach, spreading substantial shaking across an area that can span multiple cities and even cross international borders, which is exactly the pattern seen here. Colombia's building stock across many of these coffee region cities, older masonry structures, unreinforced brick, buildings constructed before modern seismic codes were widely enforced, was simply not engineered to withstand sustained moderate to strong shaking spread across this wide a footprint, which is a meaningful part of why the destruction reached as far as it did, rather than concentrating narrowly around the epicenter itself. The country's clearest prior benchmark for a disaster on this scale dates back to 1999, when a magnitude 6.2 earthquake near Armenia killed more than 1,100 people, a disaster that remains the deadliest earthquake in Colombia's modern history and whose memory is clearly shaping how seriously officials are treating the current response. That 1999 quake, notably, was a shallow event, meaning this week's magnitude 7.4, despite originating far deeper underground, has already produced a comparable scale of injury and destruction through a genuinely different mechanism, which says something meaningful about just how much larger this earthquake's total energy release actually was. On the standard logarithmic magnitude scale, each full step represents roughly 32 times more released energy, meaning Monday's magnitude 7.4 unleashed something in the range of 1,000 times more energy than the shallower 1999 Armenia quake, even though that 2001-era disaster is the one Colombians have spent a generation treating as their worst-case historical reference point. There's a political dimension to this disaster that adds real weight to how it's being handled. President Abelardo de la Espriella had only been sworn into office the Friday before the earthquake struck, meaning this disaster arrived as the very first major test of his presidency within days of taking power. De la Espriella has said he personally convened an emergency committee to lead rescue efforts directly, telling residents in a video message that the state was present and actively working on their behalf. Since then, he's toured the affected coffee-growing region in person and announced economic relief measures for impacted communities. Colombia's interior minister, describing the government's immediate priorities, put it plainly: saving lives, making sure rescue teams can actually reach the hardest hit areas and getting medical supplies and field hospitals into place as fast as possible. International support has moved quickly too. The U.S. State Department announced $5 million in assistance, and government leaders across the U.S., South America, Europe, and the Middle East have all pledged further support for the ongoing rescue and recovery effort. There's a political dimension to this disaster that adds real weight to how it's being handled. President Abelardo de la Espriella had only been sworn into office the Friday before the earthquake struck, meaning this disaster arrived as the very first major test of his presidency within days of taking power. De la Espriella has said he personally convened an emergency committee to lead rescue efforts directly, telling residents in a video message that the state was present and actively working on their behalf. Since then, he's toured the affected coffee-growing region in person and announced economic relief measures for impacted communities. Colombia's interior minister, describing the government's immediate priorities, put it plainly: saving lives, making sure rescue teams can actually reach the hardest hit areas, and getting medical supplies and field hospitals into place as fast as possible. International support has moved quickly too. The U.S. State Department announced $5 million in assistance, and government leaders across the U.S., South America, Europe, and the Middle East have all pledged further support for the ongoing rescue and recovery effort. It's worth reflecting on just how difficult it is for any government, let alone one barely days old, to manage a crisis of this scale. Coordinating search and rescue operations across multiple major cities simultaneously requires moving specialized equipment, cranes, excavators, structural engineers, and trained rescue dogs along mountainous roads that may themselves have sustained earthquake damage, all while managing communications with a population that's lost power, cell service, and in some cases clean water across entire neighborhoods. The fact that De la Espriella's administration had barely had time to settle into office before facing this test is part of why his personal, hands-on involvement touring affected cities directly rather than managing the response purely from the capital has drawn specific attention in Colombian media coverage of the disaster. Whether that approach translates into an effective long-term recovery effort is something that will only become clear over the weeks and months ahead, well after the search and rescue phase currently underway has concluded. As of the most recent reporting, this disaster is still firmly in its active search and rescue phase, not yet the recovery and rebuilding phase. Rescue crews have continued working through consecutive nights in multiple cities simultaneously, using cranes and heavy excavators alongside bare-handed digging in spots where equipment simply can't reach, cutting through twisted steel and passing buckets of rubble hand to hand in the desperate hope of finding more survivors alive. With more than 70 aftershocks already recorded since Monday, and given how many buildings across Pereira, Cali, Manizales, and the surrounding region have sustained damage that isn't always visible from street level, structural engineers now face an enormous task in the weeks ahead, just determining which buildings are actually safe to re-enter. Manizales alone logged thousands of inspection requests within the first 2 days, a backlog local officials say will take at least a month to clear, and that's just one of the affected cities. For residents across this entire region, that means an extended stretch of genuine uncertainty ahead, sleeping in temporary shelters or outdoors, waiting on formal safety assessments before they can return home, even in buildings that technically survived the initial shaking without visibly collapsing. Given how fast the numbers in this disaster have already moved, from an initial report of around 20 dead on Monday morning to well over 150, and by some counts, well over 200, within roughly 36 hours, it's worth treating any single figure you hear as a snapshot of a genuinely moving situation rather than a final accounting. Officials at every level, from the president down to individual city mayors, have been consistent in warning that these numbers will keep rising as search teams reach areas that remain physically difficult to access, particularly across the mountainous terrain closer to the epicenter itself. This is a disaster that's still actively unfolding, not one that's already been fully counted. I'll be tracking this closely as rescue operations continue, and the fuller scope of the damage becomes clear over the coming days, and I'll bring you an update as the situation develops. If you want to follow how Colombia's recovery unfolds from here, subscribe now.